Every town has someone like him. Quiet, polite, reliable. The kind of neighbor you trust without thinking twice. The kind of man who waves when you pass him on the sidewalk and helps shovel snow in the winter without being asked. For years, that man was Ethan Caldwell. If you lived on Brookfield Lane, a quiet suburban street just outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, you probably knew his face. He was the guy who left for work early every morning in the same gray pickup truck. The man who kept his yard neat and his curtains drawn. The neighbor who rarely caused problems and never attracted attention. In a neighborhood where people valued routine and privacy, Ethan Caldwell blended in perfectly. And that is exactly why the moment police finally opened the basement door of his home would leave an entire community questioning how they had overlooked the truth for so long. The morning it happened, the street looked like any other weekday in that part of Iowa. School buses rolled through the neighborhood. Commuters backed out of their driveways. But just after sunrise, patrol cars quietly began lining the curb outside Ethan Caldwell's small two-story house. At first, neighbors assumed it was a routine call. Maybe a dispute, maybe a misunderstanding that would be sorted out quickly. Yet as more officers arrived, followed by detectives carrying equipment cases and evidence containers, the calm rhythm of the street began to shift. People stepped outside their homes, watching from behind fences and mailboxes as investigators walked up the driveway and entered the house where Ethan had lived alone for nearly 9 years. What they would eventually find inside would raise a question that investigators themselves struggled to answer. How had a man who seemed so ordinary managed to hide so much for so long? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this often begin quietly, with details that appear insignificant until someone looks closely enough to see how they connect. Because for nearly a decade, the people who lived around Ethan Caldwell believed they understood exactly who he was. He worked long shifts at a regional distribution warehouse outside the city. Coworkers described him as reserved but dependable. He rarely missed a day of work and almost never spoke about his personal life. On weekends, he spent time repairing things around his house or driving into town for groceries. Nothing about those routines seemed unusual. Nothing suggested the kind of discovery that would soon turn his quiet street into the center of a growing investigation. But when detectives began searching the house that morning, they quickly realized the story surrounding Ethan Caldwell was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. At first, the interior looked ordinary enough. The living room was tidy. The kitchen counters were clean. Framed photographs hung neatly on the walls. Everything about the house reflected the same careful routine neighbors had observed for years. Yet investigators kept moving through the rooms with a focus that suggested they were looking for something very specific. Eventually, they reached a door at the end of a narrow hallway, a door that led down into the basement. According to later reports, the moment that door opened would become the turning point of the entire investigation. For nearly a decade, everyone believed Ethan Caldwell was just another ordinary man living an ordinary life. A quiet house in a quiet neighborhood. A predictable routine that never seemed to change. But that belief began to collapse the moment investigators stepped downstairs and started piecing together what had been hidden beneath the surface of that quiet life. Because the truth about Ethan Caldwell would not appear in a single dramatic moment. It would unfold slowly through records, witness statements, and details that had been overlooked for years. And that brings us to the question that would soon spread through the neighborhood, across local news stations, and eventually through national headlines. What exactly was Ethan Caldwell hiding? And how did no one notice? Ethan Caldwell lived in a quiet town outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a place where most people still left their front porch lights on through the night, and neighbors recognized each other's cars long before they recognized the license plates. It was the kind of town where crime rarely made headlines, and where people believed they understood the routines of the families living around them. In that setting, Ethan Caldwell fit perfectly into the background. He had lived in the same modest house on Brookfield Lane for nearly 9 years. He drove the same gray pickup truck every day, worked steady shifts at the regional distribution warehouse just outside the city, and rarely gave anyone a reason to question who he was. If you asked the people who lived nearby to describe him, most of them would have given the same answer. Quiet, polite, respectful. The sort of neighbor who never caused problems and rarely drew attention to himself. But as investigators would later discover, the truth about Ethan Caldwell could not be understood by looking only at the routines everyone saw. It required examining the people who crossed his path during the years he lived in that neighborhood. One of those people was a man named Mark Ellis. Mark worked at the same distribution warehouse as Ethan and had spent several years sharing overlapping shifts with him. At first, their relationship was limited to brief conversations during work breaks or casual greetings while loading shipments. Mark described Ethan as reliable but distant, someone who did his job carefully and avoided unnecessary conversation. Nothing about those early interactions seemed unusual. Yet over time, Mark began noticing small details that felt slightly out of place, moments that did not quite match the image of the quiet coworker everyone believed they knew. Another person who would eventually become central to the story was Detective Ryan Carter, a veteran investigator with the Cedar Rapids Police Department. Ryan Carter had spent more than 15 years working cases that ranged from property crimes to complicated investigations involving multiple counties. By the time Ethan Caldwell's name first appeared in his reports, Carter had already learned that the most important clues often came from the smallest observations. A single comment, a routine detail that seemed ordinary until someone looked at it from a different angle. At the beginning of the investigation, Carter did not yet know how deeply Ethan Caldwell's life would eventually be examined. But he did know that the moment a quiet name appears repeatedly in witness statements, it is usually worth paying attention. As investigators later began assembling the pieces of Ethan Caldwell's life, several questions quickly emerged. Who was Ethan Caldwell really beyond the routines his neighbors saw every day? What had he been doing inside that quiet house for nearly a decade? And perhaps most difficult of all, why did it take so long for anyone to notice that something about his life did not quite match the image he presented to the world? Those questions would guide the investigation as detectives, co-workers, and neighbors slowly revisited moments that once seemed unimportant. Because when investigators finally pieced the story together, they realized something far more disturbing than anyone expected. To understand how Ethan Caldwell managed to live unnoticed for so many years, investigators eventually turned their attention to the story of his life long before anyone on Brookfield Lane knew his name. Ethan had grown up in a small Midwestern town about 2 hours from Cedar Rapids, the kind of place where most people finished high school and either stayed to work locally or moved to nearby cities looking for stable employment. People who remembered Ethan from those early years often described him in nearly identical terms. Quiet, responsible, a little distant, but dependable. He was never the loudest person in the room and rarely sought attention, but teachers and classmates remembered him as someone who followed rules and avoided trouble. He completed his assignments on time, kept his circle of friends small, and preferred routines that rarely changed. From the outside, his childhood appeared calm and uncomplicated, which made the later events surrounding his name even harder for many people to understand. After finishing school, Ethan followed a path that many young men in that part of the country considered practical. Instead of chasing unpredictable opportunities, he took a job with a regional distribution company that handled shipments for retailers across several states. Over the years, he worked his way through the warehouse system, learning inventory management, logistics scheduling, and equipment operations. By the time he reached his early 30s, Ethan Caldwell had become a warehouse supervisor, a position he would hold for nearly 12 years. The job suited his personality perfectly. It required organization, attention to detail, and the ability to work long shifts without needing constant supervision. Coworkers often described him as efficient and reliable. He rarely missed work and rarely asked for favors. When problems appeared during overnight shipments or delivery delays, Ethan was the kind of supervisor who stayed late to make sure the issue was handled properly. Outside of work, Ethan's life remained simple. Several years after moving to Cedar Rapids, he purchased the modest house on Brookfield Lane where neighbors would eventually come to know him as the quiet man with the gray pickup truck. The home was small but well-maintained, with a narrow driveway and a backyard that backed up against a line of trees separating the neighborhood from an older service road. For most of the people living nearby, Ethan Caldwell represented the kind of neighbor everyone appreciates having. He greeted people politely when they crossed paths in the driveway. During winter storms, he often cleared snow from the sidewalks of elderly residents who struggled to manage the work themselves. When packages were delivered while neighbors were away, Ethan sometimes brought them to their doorsteps later in the evening. Small gestures like those reinforced the impression that he was thoughtful and considerate. If you had asked anyone on that street to describe Ethan Caldwell during those years, the answers would have sounded almost identical. He was polite, quiet, helpful when someone needed assistance. The kind of neighbor who caused no problems and rarely gave people a reason to think twice about the life he was living behind the walls of his house. He shoveled snow for elderly neighbors. He kept his yard trimmed and his porch light working. And if you asked anyone on Brookfield Lane about Ethan Caldwell, they would have said the same thing without hesitation. He seemed completely normal. But as investigators would later learn, there were small details about Ethan's life that few people noticed at the time. Despite living in the neighborhood for nearly a decade, he almost never invited anyone inside his home. Neighbors spoke with him in driveways, on sidewalks, or near their mailboxes, but very few had ever stepped through his front door. Even casual visitors such as delivery drivers or maintenance workers rarely entered the house. Ethan usually met them outside or handled quick conversations on the porch before closing the door again. His work schedule also seemed slightly unusual compared with others at the warehouse. While most supervisors rotated between daytime and evening shifts, Ethan frequently volunteered for late-night hours or extended overnight responsibilities. Coworkers occasionally joked that he seemed more comfortable working when fewer people were around. During breaks in the warehouse cafeteria, he rarely discussed his personal life. Conversations about family, vacations, or relationships usually ended quickly if someone asked Ethan direct questions. He would respond politely, change the subject, and return his attention to work. At the time, none of those habits appeared alarming. Many people simply assumed Ethan Caldwell valued privacy more than most. In a town where neighbors respected each other's boundaries, that explanation seemed reasonable enough. Yet when investigators later reviewed the years leading up to the search of Ethan's home, those quiet details began to form a pattern that felt harder to ignore. Because the people who knew Ethan Caldwell best would eventually admit that something about him always felt slightly off. Not threatening, not alarming, just difficult to explain. A sense that the calm routines everyone observed might not reveal the entire story. And it was during one ordinary workday at the distribution warehouse that a coworker named Mark Ellis would notice a detail that no one else had paid attention to. For years, Mark Ellis worked the same warehouse floor as Ethan Caldwell without giving him much thought. In a facility that moved thousands of packages every night, most employees focused only on the tasks directly in front of them. Supervisors managed inventory, forklifts moved pallets across concrete aisles, and trucks arrived and departed on tight schedules. Ethan Caldwell was simply part of that routine. He handled shift reports, checked delivery logs, and walked the floor with the quiet focus people had come to expect from him. Mark often described him as efficient but distant, the type of supervisor who kept conversations short and rarely stayed longer than necessary in the break room. For a long time, nothing about Ethan's behavior stood out. But over the months leading up to the investigation, small details began catching Mark's attention. At first, the changes were subtle enough that Mark almost ignored them. Ethan had always worked long hours, yet he started stepping away from the warehouse floor more often than usual. Sometimes he left the building briefly during shifts, returning several minutes later with a vague explanation about checking a delivery schedule or making a phone call. Other supervisors rarely did that because the warehouse relied on constant oversight. When Mark asked casually where he had gone, Ethan usually brushed off the question with a short answer and quickly changed the subject. The behavior did not immediately seem suspicious, but the pattern repeated itself often enough that Mark began remembering each instance. Around the same time, Ethan also started receiving phone calls late at night while they were working. Most employees kept their phones silent during shifts because the warehouse environment required concentration. Yet Ethan's phone vibrated frequently enough that Mark began noticing it from across the office desk they occasionally shared. When Ethan answered those calls, he stepped away from other employees and spoke quietly, often walking toward the back exit of the building where fewer people could hear the conversation. When he returned, his tone seemed slightly different, more tense than the calm supervisor Mark had known for years. If someone asked whether everything was all right, Ethan usually responded with a brief nod before returning to paperwork or inventory checks. One particular evening would later stand out clearly in Mark Ellis's memory. The shift had been moving normally, with delivery trucks arriving and departing according to schedule. Around midnight, Ethan's phone rang again. Mark noticed the change in Ethan's expression almost immediately. Instead of letting the call go to voicemail as he sometimes did, Ethan answered quickly and stepped away from the office. His voice was low enough that Mark could not hear the conversation clearly, but he could see that something about the call had changed Ethan's mood. A few moments later, Ethan returned, gathered his jacket, and told the staff he needed to leave the warehouse for a short time to handle an issue connected to a shipment. Supervisors rarely left the building during overnight shifts unless there was an emergency involving deliveries or equipment. When Mark asked what had happened, Ethan replied that a scheduling problem needed to be handled immediately and that he would return soon. The explanation sounded rushed, and Ethan was already moving toward the exit before anyone could ask more questions. Within seconds, he disappeared through the warehouse doors and drove away in his gray pickup truck. Mark Ellis stood there watching the truck's headlights fade into the darkness beyond the loading docks. At the time, he could not explain why the moment stayed with him, but something about the sudden departure felt unusual. Ethan had always been calm and controlled during stressful situations, yet that phone call had triggered a reaction Mark had never seen before. It was the first time Mark Ellis wondered if Ethan Caldwell might be hiding something. For several weeks after that night, Mark tried to convince himself the situation had a simple explanation. Workplaces are full of moments that appear strange at first, but eventually turn out to be ordinary. Perhaps Ethan had been dealing with a personal emergency or a family issue he did not want to discuss. Mark returned to his routine, focusing on shipments and schedules the same way he always had. But the memory of that sudden departure lingered in the back of his mind. And weeks later, something happened that would confirm his suspicion. Several weeks after Mark Ellis first noticed Ethan Caldwell leaving work in a hurry, something happened on Brookfield Lane that would later become one of the earliest moments investigators examined closely. It was a quiet Thursday evening near the end of autumn. Most of the neighborhood had already settled in for the night. Porch lights were on, televisions flickered behind living room windows, and the streets were mostly empty except for an occasional passing car. Around 10:40 p.m., a woman who lived 2 houses away from Ethan's home later told police she heard a sudden loud noise coming from the direction of his backyard. At first, she assumed it might have been something simple like a tool falling in the garage or a heavy object being moved. Yet a few minutes later, she heard another sharp sound followed by what she described as a brief moment of shouting. Concerned but unsure what exactly she had heard, she stepped outside onto her porch and looked toward Ethan Caldwell's house. The lights inside were on, but nothing appeared unusual from the street. The neighbor eventually called the local police department, explaining that the noise sounded serious enough that someone might want to check on it. When officers arrived about 15 minutes later, they performed a brief welfare check around the outside of Ethan's property. According to the report filed that night, the house appeared quiet and orderly. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no visible disturbance in the yard. Ethan Caldwell himself answered the door calmly when officers knocked, explaining that he had been moving some heavy equipment in the basement and may have accidentally dropped something. The explanation seemed reasonable enough. The officers spoke with him briefly, noted that everything appeared under control, and left the property without opening any kind of formal investigation. For the people living nearby, the moment quickly faded into the background of everyday life. Brookfield Lane returned to its usual rhythm within a day or two. Children walked to school. Commuters drove to work. Ethan Caldwell's gray pickup truck continued leaving the driveway each morning just before sunrise. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that the brief police visit would soon take on a completely different meaning. Then, 3 days later, a missing person report was filed at the Cedar Rapids Police Department. The man reported missing was a 36-year-old contractor named Kevin Mercer who had been working temporary renovation jobs in the area. According to his family, Kevin had last spoken to them late Sunday evening before heading out to meet someone connected to a possible work opportunity. When he failed to return home or answer his phone the following morning, concern began spreading quickly among relatives and coworkers. Kevin Mercer had always been dependable with communication. Disappearing without explanation was something his family insisted had never happened before. Detectives began the process that usually follows missing person reports. They reviewed Kevin Mercer's phone records, spoke with coworkers, and tried to identify the last confirmed location where anyone had seen him. The timeline slowly began forming through witness statements and digital records. A gas station clerk confirmed Kevin had stopped for fuel shortly before 9:30 p.m. that Sunday night. Security footage from the station showed his truck leaving the lot and turning toward the residential neighborhoods on the north side of Cedar Rapids. Phone data from Kevin's mobile device later placed his signal moving through several streets that eventually connected to the same quiet area where Ethan Caldwell lived. At first, those details seemed like ordinary pieces of information that might or might not lead investigators anywhere important. But then another detail appeared. A doorbell camera from a house located near the entrance of Brookfield Lane captured a vehicle matching Kevin Mercer's truck driving slowly through the street shortly after 10:15 p.m. The footage was grainy, but detectives were able to confirm the vehicle model and license plate matched Kevin's registration. That meant the missing contractor had entered the exact neighborhood where Ethan Caldwell lived on the same night a neighbor reported hearing loud noises from his house. Investigators began speaking with residents along the street to see if anyone had noticed unfamiliar vehicles or unusual activity that evening. Several people recalled seeing a pickup truck they did not recognize parked briefly near the middle of the block before driving away again. Others remembered hearing the police knock on Ethan Caldwell's door later that night after the noise complaint. Individually, those details did not prove anything. Neighborhoods often see unfamiliar vehicles passing through, and the earlier police visit had already concluded there was no immediate problem. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. A missing contractor passing through a residential street on the same evening someone reported hearing loud noises from a nearby house. Situations like that sometimes occur without any real connection. Yet as detectives continued mapping the timeline of Kevin Mercer's final movements, one detail kept returning to the center of the conversation. The last confirmed location of Kevin Mercer's phone signal before it went completely silent had been within a few hundred feet of Ethan Caldwell's home. That discovery prompted investigators to look more closely at the events of that evening. They reviewed the earlier police report from the noise complaint and noticed the address officers had visited that night. The same address where Ethan Caldwell had calmly explained that he had simply dropped equipment in his basement. Detectives began asking themselves a question that would soon change the direction of the investigation entirely. Had Kevin Mercer come to Brookfield Lane to meet someone who lived there? Because once detectives placed Kevin Mercer's truck on the same street as Ethan Caldwell's house on the night he disappeared, the possibility of coincidence became harder to accept. Investigators returned to the neighborhood, this time asking more detailed questions about what residents had seen that evening. Some remembered hearing the same loud noise the original caller described. Others recalled seeing Ethan's truck parked in the driveway later than usual that night. The investigation slowly began circling closer to the quiet house on Brookfield Lane where Ethan Caldwell lived alone. Detectives still did not know whether he had any connection to Kevin Mercer at all, but the timeline now placed the missing contractor directly in front of his neighborhood on the same night police had already been called to the property. And when investigators eventually knocked on Ethan Caldwell's door again to ask if they could take a closer look inside the house, something happened that immediately caught their attention. Ethan Caldwell hesitated. The hesitation from Ethan Caldwell did not immediately prove anything, but for Detective Ryan Carter it was enough to justify looking deeper into the situation. Investigations often begin with moments exactly like that. A pause that feels slightly longer than expected. An answer that arrives a second too late. When officers asked if they could take a quick look around the house, Ethan explained politely that he would prefer to wait until they had a proper warrant. Legally, that was well within his rights, and he remained calm throughout the conversation. Yet the refusal added another layer of curiosity to a case that already contained several unusual coincidences. Within hours, Detective Ryan Carter and his team began preparing the paperwork necessary to obtain a search warrant for Ethan Caldwell's property on Brookfield Lane. By the following morning, the warrant had been approved. Just after sunrise, police vehicles returned to the quiet suburban street for the second time in less than a week. This time, the situation felt different from the brief noise complaint officers had handled earlier. Detectives arrived alongside forensic specialists carrying equipment cases, cameras, and evidence containers. Neighbors stepped outside once again, watching silently as investigators approached the front door of Ethan Caldwell's home. Ethan answered calmly, just as he had during the earlier visit. He stepped aside without argument as officers explained the warrant and began entering the house. At first, the interior looked exactly the way many people had imagined it would. The kitchen counters were clean and neatly organized. The living room furniture was arranged carefully around a small coffee table. Shelves along one wall held books and framed photographs that suggested a quiet and orderly lifestyle. Nothing about the rooms indicated chaos or struggle. In fact, the house appeared almost too organized, as though every object had been placed in a precise position. Detectives moved methodically through the rooms, opening cabinets, checking closets, and documenting anything that might eventually become important to the investigation. For several minutes, the search produced nothing that connected Ethan Caldwell to the disappearance of Kevin Mercer. As officers continued their work, they began making their way down a narrow hallway toward the back of the house. That hallway ended at a heavy door leading to the basement. One of the detectives immediately noticed something unusual about the door itself. It was reinforced with additional locks that did not match the standard hardware used throughout the rest of the house. While homeowners sometimes add extra security to certain doors, the presence of multiple locking mechanisms on a basement entrance raised quiet questions among the investigators. Detective Ryan Carter examined the door carefully before instructing another officer to begin documenting the area with photographs. Once the locks were opened, investigators stepped down the wooden staircase leading into the basement. The space below was larger than most people expected from the outside appearance of the house. Fluorescent lights illuminated several sections of the room where shelves, storage containers, and tool benches had been arranged carefully along the walls. At first glance, the area looked like a workshop combined with a storage space. Yet some of the equipment scattered across the room did not match the type of work Ethan Caldwell was known to do. Several heavy-duty tools were positioned on a metal table near the center of the basement. Others were stacked beside large plastic containers that appeared far heavier than ordinary household storage boxes. Detectives began examining each section carefully. One officer lifted the lid of a container filled with common household items. Another searched through drawers along the workbench, noting equipment that might have been used for construction or mechanical repairs. Yet Ethan Caldwell did not work in construction, nor had neighbors ever mentioned seeing him perform major renovation projects around the house. The presence of those tools added another layer of curiosity to the growing list of questions investigators were already asking. For a moment, some officers quietly wondered whether they had misinterpreted the situation entirely. Houses often contain strange collections of equipment or storage containers that turn out to be harmless once examined closely. Perhaps Ethan Caldwell simply had hobbies that neighbors never noticed. Perhaps the missing contractor Kevin Mercer had driven through Brookfield Lane without stopping at Ethan's house at all. Investigations sometimes follow confusing paths before arriving at a clear answer. But as detectives continued searching deeper into the basement, one particular container drew the attention of an officer standing near the back wall. It was larger than the others and sealed tightly with heavy latches. The container sat partially hidden behind a stack of equipment cases, as though someone had intentionally placed it out of the direct walking path. Detective Carter signaled for the officer to pause while the scene was photographed and documented carefully. Only after the documentation was complete did he give a quiet instruction to open the lid. The officer knelt beside the container and released the latches one by one. The lid lifted slowly as everyone in the room watched in silence. And that was the moment the entire case changed. The discovery inside the basement container immediately shifted the investigation into an entirely new direction. What had begun as a missing person inquiry connected to Kevin Mercer was now developing into something far more complex. Detectives secured the entire basement as a controlled evidence scene, while forensic teams carefully documented every item that had been found. The container alone raised serious questions, but as investigators continued examining the rest of the basement, they realized that the contents of the room suggested a pattern that had been carefully hidden for years. Every shelf, tool, and storage box was photographed and cataloged before being removed for analysis. Detective Ryan Carter later explained that moments like this often change the tone of an investigation instantly. Instead of asking whether a suspect might be connected to an incident, detectives begin asking how long the situation has actually been happening. As officers continued searching Ethan Caldwell's house, additional discoveries began appearing in other parts of the property. In a locked desk drawer located in the upstairs bedroom, detectives found a collection of documents that did not match Ethan's public life as a warehouse supervisor. Several folders contained detailed records of financial transactions that appeared unrelated to his job. Some of the papers listed equipment purchases and supply orders under names investigators did not immediately recognize. Other documents referenced construction materials and storage rentals in different parts of the city. The information suggested that Ethan Caldwell had been involved in activities far beyond the routine schedule his neighbors and coworkers believed defined his life. Digital evidence soon added even more questions. Investigators removed Ethan's personal computer from a desk located in the living room and delivered it to the department's cyber forensics unit. Within days, technicians were able to recover files that had been carefully organized into hidden folders within the system. Some of those files contained financial spreadsheets tracking transactions that had never appeared in Ethan's official bank records. Others included correspondence with individuals whose identities investigators had not yet confirmed. While none of those discoveries immediately explained what had happened to Kevin Mercer, they suggested that Ethan Caldwell had been maintaining a second network of activities completely separate from his normal job and public identity. Detective Ryan Carter and his team began expanding the scope of the investigation. If Ethan Caldwell had been maintaining hidden records and private financial dealings, it raised the possibility that Kevin Mercer's disappearance might not be the only incident connected to him. Detectives started reviewing unsolved reports from surrounding counties, searching for cases involving missing individuals, suspicious transactions, or unusual business dealings that might intersect with the documents found inside Ethan's house. It was a slow and careful process, but investigators understood that situations involving hidden financial activity often stretch across multiple locations and time periods. As the investigation widened, local news stations quickly learned that a quiet suburban home had become the center of a major police operation. Reporters began gathering outside the property on Brookfield Lane, filming the steady stream of evidence containers being carried from the house into police vehicles. Within hours, headlines started appearing across television broadcasts and online news sites. One phrase quickly spread through local media coverage: "Quiet neighbor under investigation." For residents who had spent years living beside Ethan Caldwell without suspecting anything unusual, the news felt impossible to process. Neighbors spoke to reporters with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Several described Ethan as polite and helpful, the same quiet man they had greeted on sidewalks and driveways for years. Others said they had rarely spoken to him, but never observed anything alarming about his behavior. For many people, the idea that detectives were searching his home for evidence connected to a missing person case seemed difficult to accept. Yet the growing presence of investigators and forensic teams suggested that the situation was far more serious than anyone had imagined. Inside the police department, the focus turned toward questioning Ethan Caldwell directly. He was brought into an interview room where Detective Ryan Carter and another investigator began asking him about Kevin Mercer and the documents discovered inside the house. Ethan remained calm during the initial conversation, answering questions in the same quiet tone neighbors had always associated with him. He insisted that he had never met Kevin Mercer and had no knowledge of the contractor's disappearance. When detectives asked about the financial records and digital files recovered from his computer, Ethan explained that the documents related to small investment opportunities and side projects he had explored over the years. Detectives listened carefully but continued presenting pieces of evidence that contradicted parts of Ethan's explanation. They showed him photographs of the basement containers, copies of the documents found in the desk drawer, and timestamps connected to the files recovered from his computer. Throughout the interview, Ethan maintained the same position. He denied having any involvement in Kevin Mercer's disappearance and insisted that the materials discovered in his house had harmless explanations. Yet as the interrogation continued, investigators grew increasingly confident that the truth surrounding Ethan Caldwell was far more complicated than he was willing to admit. The man everyone believed they knew suddenly looked very different once the evidence from his house began forming a larger picture. And while Ethan Caldwell continued denying everything inside that interview room, Detectives were preparing to confront him with a piece of evidence that would soon contradict everything he had said. As investigators continued analyzing the digital evidence taken from Ethan Caldwell's computer, one particular discovery began to change the direction of the entire case. Inside the hidden folders recovered by the cyber forensics team, detectives found encrypted files that had initially appeared unreadable. After several days of technical analysis, those files were finally opened, revealing a series of detailed records that had never been meant for anyone else to see. Among them were logs documenting meetings, locations, and communications connected to individuals whose names had not yet appeared anywhere in the official investigation. Some entries referenced phone numbers that did not match contacts stored in Ethan's regular device. Others listed dates and addresses that seemed to correspond with temporary storage facilities and rented workspaces around the Cedar Rapids area. At first, the records looked like scattered fragments of information, but when detectives began comparing them with phone data and financial records already collected from Ethan's house, a disturbing pattern started to form. The documents showed that Ethan Caldwell had been communicating with several individuals under alternate accounts that had never been connected to his name. One of those accounts, registered through an encrypted messaging platform, contained conversations discussing equipment purchases, storage units, and meeting locations that matched several addresses investigators had been examining during the search of his home. Even more concerning was the fact that Kevin Mercer's phone number appeared inside one of those conversations only hours before the contractor had disappeared. The discovery forced investigators to reconsider everything they believed they knew about Ethan Caldwell's life. The quiet warehouse supervisor who lived alone on Brookfield Lane had been maintaining a second identity through hidden digital accounts that allowed him to conduct transactions and arrange meetings without leaving an obvious trail. The documents suggested he had been involved in activities that extended far beyond the single missing person case detectives were originally investigating. When the evidence board inside Detective Ryan Carter's office was updated with the new information, it became clear that the story surrounding Ethan Caldwell was far larger than anyone had imagined during the first search of his home. The quiet neighbor was living a second life no one had ever seen. When detectives brought Ethan Caldwell back into the interrogation room for another interview, the atmosphere felt very different from the earlier conversations. This time, the investigators carried printed copies of the digital records recovered from his computer along with transcripts of the encrypted communications linked to the hidden account. Ethan sat calmly at first, repeating the same explanations he had offered during previous questioning. But as detectives began placing the documents on the table one by one, his responses grew shorter and less confident. They showed him the communication logs referencing Kevin Mercer's phone number. They presented the timestamps connecting those messages to the same evening Mercer's truck had entered Brookfield Lane. For several minutes, Ethan Caldwell remained silent, staring at the pages spread across the table. The detectives did not interrupt the silence. They understood that moments like this often determine how an interrogation unfolds. Finally, Ethan leaned back in his chair and spoke quietly, asking how investigators had managed to access the encrypted files. When Detective Ryan Carter explained that digital evidence rarely disappears completely once forensic teams begin examining a system, Ethan lowered his eyes and rested his hands on the table. What followed marked the moment the investigation shifted from unanswered questions to a confession that would eventually dominate courtroom headlines. Ethan Caldwell began describing how he had created the hidden accounts years earlier to manage transactions and meetings that he never intended to connect to his public identity. The system allowed him to communicate with contractors and individuals who believed they were dealing with someone entirely different from the quiet warehouse supervisor living on Brookfield Lane. Kevin Mercer, according to Ethan's own account, had been one of the most recent people drawn into that network of arrangements. The confession did not unfold all at once. Investigators spent hours asking detailed questions about the records, the meetings, and the events that had led to Kevin Mercer arriving in Ethan's neighborhood on the night he disappeared. But by the end of the interrogation, the central truth had been established. The routine life Ethan Caldwell presented to the world had only been part of the story. When the case finally reached the courtroom months later, reporters filled every available seat as prosecutors presented the evidence collected during the investigation. Trial coverage spread across regional news networks as witness testimony described the search of Ethan's home, the discovery of the digital records, and the confession he had eventually given to detectives. Members of Kevin Mercer's family sat quietly through the proceedings as the timeline of the case was explained piece by piece. The jury listened as prosecutors outlined how the hidden communications and financial records connected Ethan Caldwell to a network of activities that had remained concealed for years. Defense attorneys attempted to challenge parts of the digital evidence and question the circumstances surrounding the interrogation. But the combination of recovered files, witness statements, and Ethan's own confession created a narrative that was difficult to dispute. When the jury returned with its verdict, the courtroom remained silent as the decision was read aloud. Several members of Kevin Mercer's family lowered their heads, overwhelmed by the final confirmation of what investigators had already uncovered. For years, Ethan Caldwell managed to hide the truth in plain sight. But eventually, the truth caught up with him. When the trial ended and the reporters slowly packed their equipment outside the courthouse, the story of Ethan Caldwell did not simply disappear from the minds of the people who had lived beside him for years. The quiet street on Brookfield Lane eventually returned to its normal rhythm, but the memory of what investigators uncovered inside that house stayed with the neighborhood long after the police tape had been removed. For many residents, the hardest part to understand was not just what Ethan Caldwell had done, but how easily his life had blended into the background of their own routines. For nearly a decade, he had lived among them without attracting serious attention. He walked the same sidewalks, drove the same streets, and greeted the same neighbors who now struggled to reconcile the man they remembered with the evidence revealed during the investigation. Stories like this force a difficult question. How well do we really know the people around us? In communities like the one outside Cedar Rapids, people often believe they understand the lives unfolding next door simply because they see small pieces of those lives every day. A neighbor mowing his lawn, a coworker arriving on time for every shift, a quiet man carrying groceries through his front door at the end of a long workday. Those moments create an image that feels complete, even though they represent only a fraction of someone's life. After the trial, the house on Brookfield Lane stood empty for months. The front yard still looked carefully maintained, but the driveway where Ethan Caldwell's truck once parked every evening remained empty. The porch light continued to turn on automatically each night, illuminating a home that had once appeared ordinary to everyone who passed it. Some neighbors admitted they still found themselves glancing toward the windows when they walked by, remembering how many times they had waved to Ethan without suspecting that anything about his life required closer attention. For years, Ethan Caldwell lived among them, sharing the same quiet street, the same calm routines, and the same sense of normalcy that defined the neighborhood. And no one ever imagined what he was hiding behind the walls of that house. Because sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones that look ordinary. So here's the question that stories like this leave behind long after the investigation ends. If you had lived on that street, if you had passed that house every day the way the neighbors on Brookfield Lane did, would you have noticed the warning signs? Would something about Ethan Caldwell's quiet routines have stood out to you as unusual? Or would he have seemed like just another neighbor living an ordinary life, the same way he appeared to everyone who greeted him for nearly a decade? Situations like this remind us how easily routine can create a sense of trust, and how rarely people question the familiar patterns unfolding around them. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more real crime stories that reveal the truth behind ordinary lives, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next investigation we explore together. Because if you think the story of Ethan Caldwell was disturbing, wait until you hear what happened in the next case, the one involving a neighbor who vanished without leaving a single clue behind.